Moving to final remarks, I kindly invite two members of AP's Advisory Council, Bert Koenders and Donata Garazzi, and AP's Director, Michael Silvestro Susterzik. Yeah.
Wait, I have 1 second.
For like a TV. To change a bit the framework.
Yeah.
Ce l'ho? Come faccio foto?
Apriamo già questa che c'è aperta. Yeah, we got it. We do?
So we welcome two AP Council members, Bert Koenders and Donata Garazzi, here for their final remarks, and AP Director Michael Silvestro Susterzik. And we also welcome the participation of three groups that have followed the conference today and will be presenting their own questions to guide our final remarks. So to begin with, could we hear from the Italian Initiative on International Mediation? The Italian Initiative on International Mediation.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Simone Ceresa, co-founder of the Italian Initiative on International Mediation. I had a question regarding an actor that has not been mentioned today. We've been talking about the complexity, the changing landscape in the peace world, on the global setting, but we have never mentioned the private sector. So in the actual moment in the international relation, it seems that today the private sector contributes exclusively or much more to the creation of problems rather than to the finding the solutions. And I was wondering if you, through your experience of both in working politically and with the private sector, could give us an idea about how to engage the private sector constructively, and maybe telling us where there are positive cases of private sector being also part of the solution. Thanks a lot.
And next, we'll take a comment and question from the students of the American University of Rome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. Anastasia from American University of Rome. And my question is mostly about the identities that were mentioned during the last session. We were talking about the importance of identities in the conflicts and how they should be changed in order to start the negotiation process and in order to start the peace building process. Do you think it's possible to change the socio-psychological identities? And if it is, what are the first steps that we can take to start changing those identities? Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, we will take a question from the Johns Hopkins University students and volunteers of the forum.
Okay, thank you. I'm Eleonora, represent both the volunteers and John Hopkins. Something we all agreed was that in these 2 days we learned that peace doesn't have a single face. And creativity is key to bring peace in the world. And as young practitioners, we wonder how we can bring at the macro level or at the international level peace, starting from the education of peace. We have seen yesterday in the theater how important it is to educate to peace. How can we start doing that? How, as young practitioner, can spread the word of peace? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank Dea for having been the Maîtresse of Ceremony throughout the conference. So thank you so much for having been our guide and voice in presenting all the panels. So I'm very honored to be here with our esteemed members of Agency for Peace Building Advisory Council. So we have Donata Garrasi, who is Vice President and Head of Multilateral Engagement and Peace Building at Peace Invest. And we have Bert Koenders, who is the President at the Dutch Advisory Council on Peace and Security, Koopmans Professor at Leiden University, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for International Development, as well as former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. So that's the CV part, and now let's get it a bit informal, since we had our stakeholders, basically colleagues and friends, who raise a set of very interesting questions, which I think will be the preliminary part of a debate that we hope will be followed in a while. Challenging question, I might say. I would start maybe, if you do agree, with a question about the private sector. We have Donata here. So I would start with this one, but of course, then you are more than happy. I mean, I'm very happy if you can share your thoughts as well about other points, and then I will go to Bert.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for having us here. First, the conversations have been really exciting. And then I see Bert after more than 10 years of us working together on a peace process, well, on an international dialogue on peace building and state building, which was aiming at changing the way peace and stability are supported. The private sector, so I don't know who said that, but we've heard several times you can't eat dialogue, which is true. At the same time, without dialogue, you really can't eat. So that leads me to thinking that the whole idea of dialogue, peace negotiation, peace processes, if it's not matched by investment in peace, on the economics of peace, on creating vibrant economies that can create jobs for the former combatants, for people who are marginalized in rural communities, and so on and so forth. Your great dialogue and your wonderful peace process, even in those rare cases, unfortunately, where it has been successful, is not going to create peace. I think we've seen it over and over. And I dare say that the reason why we see so much conflict going on, besides the big ones, you know, the hotspot of CNN, is because there hasn't been investment. And by investment, I mean private investment going in generating those economies, those incentives that keep people away from fighting. What does that mean? So private sector is everywhere, plus we should spend 2 hours defining private sector, and we won't. But you do have private sector, local private sector, regional private sector, multinationals, more or less everywhere where we work in the midst of conflict, as well as in countries that are recovering. One big gap is investment. So your private sector needs to have money to grow and to expand and to be more inclusive and to do all the great things that we keep on saying the private sector should do. Be conflict sensitive, community engagement, and etc. And very sadly, countries that are affected by conflict don't attract investment. And we know why. Because of the real or perceived, in many instances, risks. So it's very costly for investors to go to even Liberia or Sierra Leone, let alone the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So what we need to focus on when we talk about private sector is let's figure out ways to attract investment to support vibrant private sector, young entrepreneurs, companies that are ready to grow, but they can't because they can't access reasonably priced capital. And how do we do that? We need to develop financing instruments and financing vehicles that allow investment from the big institutional investors that have loads of money, many of whom sits in big developed countries, so that these investors can go, they can invest. Their investment can be de-risked, so they can't say, no, I'm not going to Sierra Leone because it's so expensive. And through investment vehicles that are peace positive, so they have an intention to address peace. They have KPIs, key performance indicators that are linked to peace, so that if I'm an institutional investor in Norway, I'm going to, let me use Sierra Leone because it hasn't been mentioned and it's a post-conflict country. Conflict has ended more than 20 years ago and no one wants to go because it's so risky. I'm an investor in Norway. I have my good peace positive investment and I'm going to Sierra Leone and my capital is protected. I make money, but at the same time, I am investing in an economy of peace. This is what I think is the change in mindset and is also the change in the narrative that we need to promote globally and then in regions and in countries. And let me just finish by saying, and the private sector and the investment shall not come from the likes of the World Bank or the African Development Bank or the Asian Development, wherever you are. It really needs to come from private sources because it's a completely different business. I'll stop there.
So this reminds me of something that has been said, don't show me your intention, but show me your budget. I think it's like a summing up. Thank you so much, Donata. Bert, if you want to add something about that, and then we'll maybe look at the other questions as well.
What can I add after this? Great. I mean, no, I can, but it's really, Donata is very active, I think, in a magnificent program that deals with especially the social contract in conflict countries and how you can support that in very professional ways. Let me just first thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with Donata for peace building in Bologna. This is a great institute that is evolving every day, and I'm very glad to be with all these peacemakers here. Let me just say as a small introduction, if I may, and I really enjoyed very much listening to all the different introductions. I think we have to really now, it's almost a cliche, but we live in a world of conflict and might is right, with an enormous complexity that has been depicted here by so many analysts. And the risks of complexity is passivity, because it gets so complex, where do you actually start? I think it's very important that we do that without any naivete. And I think when I listened to many of the interlocutors, let's not use the toolbox that we always used and put it on countries. And I would very much plead for a sort of a pragmatic, no, I would say principled pragmatism. Let's really look at different conflicts. I think the mapping is important, the power relationships are important, there are different answers. And I like to very much see that around the principles. Can I just mention I go immediately to the private sector. One is subsidiarity. You use it in the European Union, it's an awful term, but it doesn't, if you really want to make sure that, you know, peace agreements are transformative, sustainable, it sometimes means that you immediately give the power to local interlocutors, but sometimes you don't. It's also that the international community doesn't have a responsibility. I was last week in Geneva in a very interesting program of peacemaking, believe it or not, on Gaza and Israel. Almost impossible to imagine. The mutual hatred, the orgy of violence, the suffering. And here I found the example very important, including with people from the private sector who were very active on this. We had victims, and there was an Israeli guy who had lost his parents and his sister. There was a guy, a Palestinian who had lost 23 members of his extended family. They were sitting together in a room, not with like-minded people, not with people who had the same view about the problem, including security actors, people who had been responsible. And they started thinking, they said two things about subsidiarity. One is they cannot act without responsibility from Europe and the United States in the region. A responsibility, in my view, that they don't take, including Europe. But there has to be something under there. Top down, in this case, is necessary, but if there is no bottom up of communities that have suffered the most talking to each other. And they are not necessarily, if I may say so, the peaceniks. They are often people who are the spoilers as well. There's much to be said about it. The private sector in all this is, in my view, very much key. And that's why I think Donata's experience is so important in it. I do have to admit I've worked a little bit for the UN and the World Bank on fragile states and the economy. We were last week, give you a big dilemma. I don't know how to solve it. We were in Qatar. Now, Qatar is a country which is, if I may say so, filthy rich. You have the highest income per capita. People don't work. They have the Indians and the Pakistani work. They have this strategic position. Somebody was calling this morning. And we were thinking through how you could engage on the fact that 50% of the women in Afghanistan don't count. Is there something to be done with the local private sector where women can still work? It's an enormous moral issue here. You're sitting with Qatar. There was somebody from the Taliban. There was the private sector. And there was the idea of not legitimizing a government which is part of massive human rights violations. In my view, the private sector can have an enormous positive and also a negative role. First comes the local private sector. In many countries, that's the key. The second is there are negatives. You go to the last, I'm sorry if I'm a former politician, so I dare to speak. The latest relationship between the European Union and Rwanda on raw materials means that more coltan is going to be smuggled out of Colombia via Rwanda, because it's now one of the biggest exporters. They don't have it themselves. So here's the whole chain responsibility, ESG and so on, of the government. We can be much stronger in Europe on that. That is contributing to conflict. So let's start with do no harm. But the other side is maybe even more important. Than there, I have nothing to add to what Donata is. In the end, it's not only grief, it's grievance and grief. There is no, I mean, if you go to Guatemala, there's been a peace agreement. Unfortunately, it's not been followed by some of the political parties. But the key problem, which can become the case also in Colombia, is with an absence of the state that the private sector in the end is not going to help create jobs. In Mali, if you don't have the jobs, you're gonna go in human trafficking, you're gonna go in drug trafficking. It's absolutely key that we help in Europe, blending finance, support the private sector in job creation, sometimes with foreign investment, sometimes with equity capital, and we're stimulating the local private sector. And I think it's awkward that if we talk about co-responsibilizing and different stakeholders, this is not a key one. And without it, you won't solve the problem of poverty. In 2030, you look at the SDGs, all poverty is in, 80%, I shouldn't exaggerate, of all poverty is in fragile states. So that's your first goal, I think.
I'm actually very happy, thank you for raising this point as well, that also this actor that has been maybe didn't mention so much until now only sometimes, but I think it's very important that we also draw attention to this aspect of budgeting, financing, and how we do that in an ethical and wise and effective way. If I may borrow one term you use, the principled pragmatism, I think this partly responds also to the question about identity. So who to engage, how, to what extent. I think it's this principle pragmatism, something that came out in this dilemma between inclusion and effectiveness. Each one of us has their perspective and experience. I think there is a wide difference also in different contexts. So I think that's part of the answer as well about how to actually include and in which ways different type of actors with an intersectional perspective that is highly contextualized. So that's something I borrow because I think it's a bit of a sum up of various topics, various reasoning that has been raised throughout the different panels. The tension between, I think we also had a conversation yesterday about a principle and the idealism, but also the pragmatism and realism. But I think that's a big tension, isn't that? A challenging question.
Yeah, but I'm very bad because Dutch politics was Castro long speech. This is such an enormously difficult question. Don't have the right. I think we should take identity much more serious. At the same time, so important. I give you just an example. Small initiative. Try to get to the question. And this one of the most. You have to respect each other's identity. You as a Palestinian, Arab, so on and so forth. But in the end, the only question that session, I mentioned it because it's one of the most difficult. You cannot imagine feel distant of the world. Like you need a police if somebody kills your own family. You are not in a situation. The only thing is identity. Past, you're all human beings. All in this case, those talking about casualties. You lose time when you have no work. Things like that. Identity. Secondly, colleague is here from Nigeria. He could say much better. I don't know if he's still there. But I was seeing when I worked in Mali, and you see it now, that the fight against jihadism, which by the way is a necessary fight. The problem is, shouldn't you also not talk, have alternatives, and at the same time ensure that the instrumentalization of identity by military players is not reduced. You see now that actually, you know, in this case with the Pearl and the Fulani and others, I will leave the details there, that more and more one side is supported by the government forces of Mali and now also, unfortunately, the Wagner forces. And on the other side, there is a sort of, if you want to talk about intersectionality, that's not the one you want, between extremist forces and military agents, and also a group who feels actually economically disadvantaged between nomads and herders. Well, and I should now give to Donata because she was working on West Africa. She knows much better than I. We were working on it actually together. But so I am a bit more critical about this identity politics. Take it serious. When we were negotiating with the Tuaregs, by the way, where the women decide in the end. A very interesting thing. We had a peace agreement, we thought, and then the Tuareg group said to us, yeah, but you know, we need to, it takes 3 weeks to sign it, and we were all of this school that was, I think, correctly criticized this afternoon. Take a little bit of time. The reason was they had to go home. They were not on the table, which was bad. But the good thing was they were the only ones who in the end could give the yes. And so it is interesting to talk about these identities. Again, they are specific to each situation. And let's make sure that that this is not getting something of a new victim, that it's in the end human rights that play. No double standards with human rights, but understand that's the only thing we have in the end.
Thank you, Bert.
Thank you. Let me just add a few very, very simple thoughts. So fully agree with the whole identity, manipulation, etc. Identity is not the problem. In fact, it's the wealth that we all bring. The problem is the famous 101 of negotiation, the interest versus position business. So the problem there is when we all focus on the position versus the interest. And this is what we're seeing day in, day out, despite the fact that all of us know that that's the wrong way of approaching it. So I would just leave the whole identity and try to to look at it as what we all bring to the table and focus on your position, my position, but our interest is what we need to work on. Really, one-on-one negotiations. You're more expert than me on that. Who do we bring, don't bring? I don't know if that was part of the question. Everybody. The negotiations that failed, and there are so many out there, mostly a failure because some groups were excluded. And the examples are so blatant that I don't even know why we keep on doing the mistakes. You know, the Taliban, no, we can't sit with them because of Taliban. Those others, we can't sit with them. But so everybody needs to be sitting at the table. And if it's not possible, then you find ways of doing it. This Tuareg example is fantastic. Okay, if you can't sit at the table, then figure out a way to go and consult. But let's leave all that conversation out, because this is what is preventing us from moving on with peace agreements and then with the implementation of peace agreement.
And to connect with what you said, like we had the Johns Hopkins University and volunteers of the Bologna Peace Building Forum asking about, well, reflecting about how creativity and contextualization are indeed crucial, but also asking for kind of inspirational, I don't know, like, what would you say to a young person approaching such a complex context in such a complex time, approaching so much dilemmas? And I mean, what could be your advice for young change makers, young peace builders?
Well, my first answer was I was a student at Johns Hopkins here, and it inspired me to get into this field. So that's number one. And that's a very personal connection. I think this is an absolute great school where people learn different identities, different nationalities, different problems, at least to get a view of the whole. Nobody understands everything. By the way, I think somebody said it today, there is no quick fix for peace. It's an eternal question. And each generation has to create its own path. But my concern now would be and I don't have anything against, by the way, defense budgets or the fact that we protect ourselves or that we send peacekeeping operations. The point is, do we take the same energy in creating peace? It's a very difficult job. We do war gaming, no peace gaming. Should be a class at Johns Hopkins University. In our cities, we had in the Netherlands just recently an enormous issue between local citizens and different generations of the Eritrean diaspora. The Eritrean, this country knows very well. Nobody's really discussing it among each other. They're sort of, we should kick them out of the country, or the different generations, they're even fighting with each other. There is around us, when you talk about cities, there is a dialogue also among ourselves in our cities. The problems of polarization are everywhere. It's often around identity, it's often around class. It's much more complex than is sometimes being said. There is not one big enemy. It is something that, you should make it a mission to work on peace, but always realize it's a struggle. It's not easy. It's complex. You have disappointments. You have blames. I'm part of a generation. I was working in Mali. It's disasters right now. Put many years of my efforts in it, and not my efforts, much more important of many others. But I think this dialogue, even on the issue of Israel-Palestine, I see how people are fearful to talk about it, even in universities, in businesses. Take the courage to discuss it. It is political, yes. You talk to your enemy, yes. It is sometimes difficult and painful. Everybody feels that the world today is a pretty dangerous one. But don't be overwhelmed from complexity to passivity. That's the only advice I have.
Perfect. It allows me to build on what Bert just said. So at 3 level, as young people, I think you can really get together and organize groups, dialogue groups, reach out to the other communities and become peace builders in your neighborhood, in your school, in your university campus. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago organized by the Swiss government, and they had very big names talking, and then they had a ceremony where they were giving awards to young leaders for peace. So they had in each canton They had teams of young people who have been working together, creating organizations for peace. And they were like 18, 15, 14 years old, youngsters. On the stage where minister or so-and-so were speaking 2 minutes before, because they created networks of young people to work on peace. So that's number one. I have been away from Italy, my home country, for many, many years. But when I came back and I looked around, I didn't find that kind of initiative. But I'm going to look better. Or maybe you can come and tell me, oh, we're doing it. Really highly recommend it. And by the way, this doesn't take a lot of money, because, you know, when they come and tell you, oh, we can't do that because we don't have funding, these are personally driven initiatives, and they don't really need big fundraising with the UN or the likes, or even with your government. That's number one. Then number two, who can do something about it? Academic institutions, schools. As Bert said, we should have studied peace and negotiation when we went to school a few years ago, and you should have, from maybe not primary, but secondary for sure, all the way to university and masters, peace studies, so that you learn the economics of peace, the legal aspects of peace, the this and that, and negotiation, so that it becomes a skill that you have and everybody has. Like, you know, studying history in this country, we still study Latin and Greek, which is great, but why don't you study peace, given that that's a big problem right now? So master programs, business schools, they should have peace MBAs kind of thing, okay? The economics of peace. How do you design a peace bond? How do you design a peace positive investment, etc., etc.? So that's level number two. And I hope I remember the third level, which I don't. So it will come back to me. Oh yeah, I do. No. I do. So then higher level, not high because it's more important or less. It's just more, you know, it's not those two. I've been advocating within my team, Peace Invest, an investment firm, to launch a creative industries peace bond. And the whole idea is as follows. We all think that in conflict-affected environments or post-crisis, or anyway, in every other country that is interested and concerned with peace globally, what we need to do is invest in the road, the energy infrastructure, the this and the that. If you worked a lot in Africa, and I was so pleased to hear our colleagues from the continent here and elsewhere, we do this program for former combatants, the couturier or mechanics. Honestly, most people don't want to do that, but you're going to have to do that because that's what we're funding. So now many young people are very much interested in the creative industries. Cinema, Nigeria, where's our friend from Nigeria? It's not here anymore. Anyway, Nollywood, one of the biggest ever industry of cinema. And then, you know, the fashion in the Congo is amazing. So why don't we people like me, think about how do you invest in these creative industries that can absorb and create opportunities for young people? And by the way, in this region, being the Mediterranean, the creative industries traditionally for centuries have been a channel for cooperation. Poetry, art, artisanat of all kinds. So that is something that I personally am going to try to do in the next whatever number of years. But it's a mindset of moving from the small little thing to the thinking bright. And we're in a country where fashion is very important. Let's mobilize the fashion industry to work for peace, for instance. And young people probably are going to find that interesting, attractive, and a potential way forward.
Well, I think this is indeed an overarching answer. I mean, touched many points from education to localization, networking. I like very much the create your own path. To be honest, I really like this idea of like each generation based on the changing times and and how to adapt to those changing times to be able to create their own path. So thank you very much. I would like now to, well, open the floor for some question. I think we have time. Let's see. Depending on factors, maybe for 3, starting with it. let's try to have like maximum 2-3 minute question so we can have more maybe.
Okay. I'm interested in the set of relationship between business, politics on the one hand, and on the other, negative peace and positive peace. So there is a lot of reflection here on the need for greater focus on attracting more investments into the positive piece. Do we give enough attention to the connection between private sector, politics, and the lack of negative peace, which means war? Just as an example, the connections between the US Congress members and defense stock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Should I go? Michele from the European University Institute. I have a question on the involvement of private sector in peace, because it's something we discussed also yesterday, and the connection between technology and peace. So it has also the dimension of how we involve the private sector and especially the tech sector in this venture. And many questions were raised on the fact that who is going to decide where the money goes in terms of not only development per se, but also investment in peace tech initiatives. So initiatives that use technology in a creative way to support mediation and peace processes. And we had many examples. So a lot is about creating convincing use cases, but the feeling was in the room was that the vocabulary is not there because peace is controversial, it's political. So how do we advocate with the private sector and tech companies? What kind of vocabulary or angle should we take to involve them in peace processes? And how do we measure impact? Because peace is such a broad concept. How do we demonstrate there's a return on this investment?
Hi, my name's Olivia. I'm with the American University of Rome. Thank you both for your time and your comments today. My question is about the media involvement in peace negotiations, particularly in the current world. We live with an abundance of media coverage of different media perspectives, and maybe particularly if you could touch on social medias that are much less regulated and how coverage of those and perception amongst the public impacts peace negotiations.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have plenty of like hours in front of us of debate about technology, about media, about business. So who wants to start?
Let me start with what I want to answer, and then I leave the rest to. So I'm going to pick up on the tech piece and how do you demonstrate, how do you attract them, and then how do you demonstrate peace. So first of all, I think we need to work on building the narrative of how you can do peace positive investment, what it is, what it means, and exactly how you do it, okay? It's not out there because, in fact, very few people, very few companies, very few funds invest in peace. That's number one, and I'm going to share a few thoughts about how that can be done. Number two, let us not fool ourselves. Tech companies of all kinds and sorts are very active in very many conflict-affected, post-conflict, crisis-affected environments, which countries that, by the way, leapfrogged all of us, right? So when we were still there signing checks, in Kenya, they had, as they still have, M-Pesa. They were sending each other money all around, and same in Somalia, where none of us could go because it's so dangerous. So tech solutions are there. They're being implemented, supported. Tech companies of all different kinds, from agri-tech to whatever other digital, financial inclusion, etc., They're there, they understand the opportunity. They often work at community level, serving underserved communities. For instance, we work with a bank that is banking the underbanked, really. People who can't have a bank account, they don't even have much money, and this company is in the middle of nowhere providing these services and making loads of money, yet providing a service. So I think, you know, the tech private sector is there, can get there way before all of us can even dream of getting anywhere. With good solutions, sometimes they're not good. Now, how do you, though, bring the private sector, particularly tech, into the peace space and show to them that by investing there, investing in this way, you can be peace positive? Well, you can't really today, because the two things are separated. And so the likes of us, working with others, by the way, we're developing methodologies that can help you integrate in the investment peace features. We call them peace enhancing mechanism. So you have your investment, instead of just being a tech investment that is good, it's going to be a tech investment with peace enhancing features embedded in the investment strategy and within the investment vehicle. So you have, you know, you do this and this and that. It's part of the investment itself, the investment structure, the investment governance. And then you monitor how these peace enhancing mechanisms, we call them that way, you can call them whatever you want, are doing. Are these mechanisms contributing to improving the cash flow, which is basically what the investment does, produce a cash flow? Are they contributing at the same time to enhancing social cohesion? You can do it because you have embedded these measures and you have designed key performance indicators that are attached to these peace measures. This doesn't exist yet, so we're developing it. I do think that other companies are doing the same. So in the end, you have an investment that is peace positive because it's been designed that way. You monitor those particular indicators. And on top of monitoring how much money you're making, you're monitoring what is your impact on peace, number one, and what is your impact on de-risking the investment. And the two things go together. High risk investment is never going to invest in peace. You're never going to be able to attract your tech company or your tech investor. So it's in the making. Peace finance is a relatively new field. And I think in a few years, you're going to see way more and more investments that can come and say, and can go to the market and say, this is a peace investment. This is what we have achieved in terms of peace and de-risking. So that's answer to that. And then I'm leaving the rest of it.
The media to you.
I think this was a perfect answer, isn't it? What would you like me to answer still? No, seriously, this is such an important program that Donata is representing, and I would love that goes all the support of the whole peace building agency to that work. The other questions are, of course, the more not difficult ones, but look, technology is never a solution to anything. It can be used, I'm putting it now a bit simple because of the time, can be used bad or good. Secondly, we are blind if we are the last ones. Peacemakers should be at the forefront, not at the last ones. I agree with that. Thirdly, the whole issue you're mentioning of the digital divide, it's still gigantic with a lot of developing countries, especially in conflict countries. So we have to invest in that. That digital divide is an enormous problem and an enormous opportunity. As you said, it's not only in Kenya, but in other places. At least there is an enormous possibility to, you know, go from one situation to the others within 8-9 years. Let me give you a concrete example, the issue of Myanmar. Now, Myanmar was a dictatorship. I remember going as a UN with Ban Ki-moon at the time because they didn't want to even allow humanitarian aid. And there was a big, you know, flood. The country opened up from one day to the other, including with technology and social media. And now, again, unfortunately, it's closed and part of a horrible civil war. Or civil war, it's a war of the army against the people, in fact. Within 3 years, all the Rohingyas were kicked out of the country, which was a deliberate social media campaign by, you know, Buddhist people with money. It's not the religion that I'm criticizing, it's the power structure that was making these people impossible. Like with Radio Mille Collines in Rwanda 20 years old. modern media have an enormous consequence for all kind of issues that are happening. Elections, the latest elections in Kenya, the latest elections maybe in my country, in the US. It plays even more so if there is not an issue of, you know, digital education in this term. I think for the issue we're talking about today, peacemaking, I don't have anything to add what Donata said. She knows much better, and I think it's absolutely key that we bring that in. The second is, and there we have to look at the opportunities and the risks. I think there are enormous opportunities for negotiators in using even AI. I was part of a peace game, I mentioned it to some of them months ago, on a very complex negotiation, sort of an Ethiopia, Tigray, Eritrea type of conflict, which has become so complex that even for the negotiators, it is very difficult to find what would be interesting instruments that could catalyze something positive and play with the different players. Now, AI is not so far yet, but it could be a helpful tool. But again, there immediately it is the question, what are the possibilities and what are the risks? And I think, like with all these technologies, we have to look at that very carefully. Of course, a technology can never replace, at least not so far as we know, trust building, conversations, making sure there's inclusivity. Although, there's another argument. In one of the programs we were involved in, it's called Principles for Peace, we were working with people who were never consulted in a peace process. Now, don't put an algorithm on it because it will be discriminatory, probably against women. But you can use modern media in a more sophisticated way than just the phone in trying to figure out what the sentiment is around certain issues. So I would, again, caution for the risks, but look at the enormous opportunities also for tech in making peace. And we should be as quick. Look, the person who introduced me to was General Dallaire. General Dallaire was the general who was part and parcel of the UN at the time of the genocide in Rwanda. And he became, you know, he's been personally hurt by that, even becoming, you know, in a very difficult psychological situation. Now his whole life is geared towards peace gaming. Because he said, I did war gaming for many years, we didn't have an answer. Let me look like people are doing every day with missiles, and the reaction is this and that and that. Can you do that also in other ways? That includes conversations and so on and so forth. I think that's something for a new generation to work on, peace gaming.
Well, I think we have a lot of food for thought. Donata, you wanted to? Yeah, absolutely.
To get back to the question about politics, business, and conflict. Let me sum it up that way. So I don't think anybody here has the answer. We know that big interests come together often to create bad for whatever the reason. We don't have the answer. But what I'm thinking, that's what we are trying to do. That's what Bert has tried to do, etc. Is can we shift so can we move from the economies of conflict, so where people make money out of conflict, to the economy of peace, where people make money out of peace? Because there are numbers there. Conflict costs so much, peace produces that much. Can we start speaking numbers when we speak peace and incentives, you know, the whole cost opportunity, we keep on saying. So that is what we need to move into. And today I heard loads of stuff about the European Union, this and that. But kind of that's where we moved in Europe with the European Union. We moved from an economy of conflict that created 2 world wars and much more, to one that is more or less at peace. In fact, it's very peaceful in many regards. So that would be my answer. You're never going, you know, I'm not going to speak to the big powers in DC, in Washington. But what I know is that if there's enough groups that invest in peace and create these economies from peace, then you can kind of transform regions. Then, you know, evil is always there for us to deal with. A quick one on the social media. Of course, I don't have an answer to that. You know, it's too big. You know, my own kids become so aggressive when they spend too much time on social media. It's true. The World Economic Forum risk report of this year puts hate speech, social media, however, as one of the 5 more important risks within the next 5 years that the world needs to deal with. So I don't have an answer to what do we do, but I do know it's such a big problem. And one of the answers that doesn't solve the big problem is the dialogue that we're talking about. If you send a message to your neighbor, you're going to end up fighting with your neighbor in one way or the other. So at your level, young people and all of us, more talking, less social media, but of course that's not the answer to your question, but I don't think anybody has it.
Donata, Berta, I really want to thank you. I think that as a good conference should also raise many questions to be answered. Otherwise it's like delirious to think that we are answering questions. Maybe the good thing is that we are raising good question and space for debate. So let me really thank you. Oh, there's a quick question. I will allow this. So one lady there and the sir here. Let's have a
thank you.
Flexibility of changing that.
Thank you, Joe Washington,
yes,
with the NIA Foundation. So for the past day and a half, it's often been mentioned the challenge of not having the right paradigms to address the current array of conflicts and the need for better tools and frameworks. For example, on the question of rightness that was discussed, many of you will know that Johan Galton often criticized this concept very much, that there's always work that can be done with at least one of the parties, and you should not just sit on your hands and over-romanticize getting everybody around the table. Also recall the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where the South Africans were very clear and consistent saying, don't try a cookie cutter process to do what we did. It worked for us, even with the shortcomings, design your own. So I'm thinking as part of the new paradigm we've been talking about, it requires a new commitment and expansion to professional development. More tools and approaches, and as was mentioned, our metaphorical toolbox. This includes enhanced knowledge by mediators of best and worst practices, and be willing to exert humility by allowing the various segments, including religious groups, you on are their needs, etc. I leave new mantras. That's humility, imagination/creativity, and flexibility. What other words, concepts would you suggest I add to my morning mantra?
Creativity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Creativity.
Yeah.
There's a lady also here, I think that was about to ask a question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Suwaida. I am from American University of Rome. So, okay, sorry. So my question was about, so considering the rule of UN and two-state solution in Palestine and in 1947 and the outcome that it brought to the nation, so will the UN involvement in mediation and negotiations will be useful or trustworthy in the future? And also considering the facts that also the previous speaker told about the prioritization and also polarization of the political debates and this stuff, and in the future will this organization be more polarized or become or maintain neutral and partial? Thank you.
Bert, for you as well, starting from you, and then I've heard already a creativity rising for you before.
Listen, the ladies have the last word. That's the best, actually, isn't it? Two things. I think I try to get away from toolbox to what we call then, I don't like all the terms because they're all awful, but sort of a principled pragmatism. Doesn't mean you don't look at conflict and at power and at, but you're not fixed. It's not only the neoliberal model or something. I give you an example. You know, when I worked for the United Nations as a head of a peacekeeping missions, elections in the Ivory Coast fueled conflict. I went to Mali, there was a coup d'etat, and I thought, oh my God, the first thing we shouldn't do is have elections. All the Malians told me they're wrong. They were proud people and they said, we need elections. And they had free and fair elections and they wanted it. I'm not saying that's therefore the best thing, but let's look first of all to each country in itself, respect it and understand its history and think about it. Second, I am very much for principles. Not because there is a risk to that. Naivete, big principles we'll never use. It's the hard world of war. But the things you mentioned are very key. In Bangsamoro, in the Philippines, where somebody was talking about that, there is a good peace agreement in itself between the government, the former guerrillas in the local government in Bangsamoro, and civil society. As most peace agreement, it goes after a few days, a few years down the drain because there's either not enough money, not enough private investment, there is a fatigue and things like that. We worked around 6 principles that are accepted in different cultures. This is an Islamic culture in this case, it is in the Philippines. And some of the words you were mentioning are very important. Humility is one, dignity is another. I think very key is legitimacy. Most of these peace agreements or discussions are maybe seen legitimate at one moment but not in the other. So you have to invest in that. I think that's very important. Accountable security. Nobody says that you don't need a police and an army. The question is how it works. Look at some of our operations in West Africa or in the Middle East. So these kind of principles are very good, and they were measured actually because everybody agreed to them and they learned. They went into, you know, feedback loops and so on. So I like very much how you wake up. I don't know how you wake up tomorrow morning. I would think take a good Italian coffee, the best in the world. I'm sorry for all the others. But, you know, I think that's absolutely key. On the UN, Donata worked there much longer than I, but I'll tell you one thing, don't give up on the United Nations. It's a major crisis. We all know it can only work if the Security Council is reformed. That is more and more an urgency. I think more and more countries are pleading for that. I don't exclude it will happen. In the meantime, they often have second best solutions. Sometimes they're awful. Those who work in the UN maybe can say that. I found it the most difficult and unsafe job I ever had, but never give it up for the time being. But don't focus on it as the only organization. You can have plurilateral arrangements, which basically means find friends of peace processes. Don't let yourself boxed in because the Security Council and the Russians and the Americans and Chinese won't agree, because then we're out of any political reality for the next 10 years. So that would be a shortcut and not very good advice, but that's how I look at it.
I agree.
Consensus reached. Dialogue worked. Thank you so much, really. Donata, Bert, it has been fantastic. Lively and deep and firing, deep inspiring. Wow, so it has been a very dense couple of days and they are not yet finished. I'm very emotional. It has been really great. So we had esteemed speakers, we had engaged participants, and what can I say? It has been fantastic, really fantastic. So the topic of this year was mediation at a crossroads. And well, I think we went really deep into the inner essence, if I may say, of mediation. We really look into the intrinsic variable somehow, time. What is the past? What is the present? And what could be the future look like with a foresight to the space in terms of geographic, but also in terms of like the different sectors, the different tracks. And also, if I may say, concerning space, I think one of the key aspects of the variables we've been taking into account is movement. We've been talking about innovation, about transformation, change, future. It's a field that is in constant moving, and we should move with it. But we've also been talking a lot about identities, about actors, about dilemmas. How it's complicated to find the right balance between inclusion, context, contextualization, and what type of actors. So it's a changing field. If I may also add, I mean, old ways did not always work, to be euphemistic. So we should be ready to change. Actually, we should be probably the change. All of us with our different professional roles, expertise, backgrounds, and identities, we should really be the change. We've been talking about integrating voices and groups, about going beyond the usual suspects, about decolonization, about indigenous voices, about gender, not only in terms of inclusion, but in terms of agency. So going beyond quantitative and tokenistic inclusion and going into really agency. We talked about localization, about a reconception of structures and processes. So I also would like to imagine the forum really as a crossroads, not only as a team, but as in itself symbolically a crossroad, where partnership throughout these years started, but also friendship started. A place with civil society, governmental representative, international governmental representative, academia can meet, but also where there's intergenerational dialogue happening. I've been seeing and listening, like spying a bit around. I really saw plenty of conversation in which students really have the opportunity to be treated as they should be, as change makers, because they will not be in the future. They are already picking the decision to work in this field. So we are really to be engaged. They are really to be engaged as change makers. So that's something that I saw happening every year and more and more. So it's a space of exploration, of reasoning, of brainstorming. Well, it's the 6th year. I think many changed. It's becoming bigger and bigger. And what I see here is a growing community. Not only a community of practice, you might say, a bit of principled pragmatism, but also a community of ideas, of vision, in a way. So there's a lot of professionalism, but also something else. There's passion. There's a special drive to change and a special drive to build peace. So I think it has been unforgettable, and I want to thank all of you for making it possible. Now, let me thank personally all the institutions and people who made it possible. For the patronage, we want to thank the Comune di Bologna, Regione Emilia-Romagna, Agenzia Italiana per la Cooperazione e lo Sviluppo, the Johns Hopkins University SAIS, l'Università di Bologna e la Rete Università per la Pace. For the support, we want to thank il Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale, la Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, Rotary Bologna Ovest Guglielmo Marconi, l'Osservatorio Centro Ricerca sulle Vittime Civili di Conflitti e l'Associazione Nazionale Vittime Civili di Guerra e Prometeia. And then to our internal Agency for Peace Building team. First of all, to Maria Chiara Giaccai, who managed the whole forum and made it all possible. To Bernardo Venturi for the scientific direction. Megan Gettin for the communication. And then to Sara Buccapusca, Daniel Canosa, our interns, and to all our fantastic volunteers. Dea, Anna, Lea, Ornella, Miron, Alejandra, Eleonora, Ginger, and Lucas. Let me thank all of AP members, advisors, and the members of Advisory Council, and all the technical support we received for the photo and videos and everything. And finally, last but not the least, thank you so much for all the speakers and all the participants. Well, see you next year. Sorry, there's going to be an aperitif now to keep going with our networking and socialization. Thank you. Sorry.
Hello. Do you know where